Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, narrated by the author, Malc Cowle. Book 1, The Manchester Chartist. Chapter 4. Here you are, love, get that drunk. Bess turned over as Daniel stroked her thick dark hair. They shouldn't have let me sleep in, Daniel. Why not, lass? You'll be tied fast to your spinning mule for long enough today. I'll take Daniel to Mary Upton's Folly. What are thy plans? She asked, smiling at his concern. I've had an idea. I've heard they need woodworkers in cast iron trade, pattern makers they call them. Well, me love, let's hope they find summat, she said, picking up the cup of tea and blowing across it. I'm sorry, Bess. I feel reet badly I'm no doing me bit. Stop reet there, Daniel, I cried. Thou art doing thy best. Nobody has reet to ask for more. We'll manage. Times are hard, but we're a pair and we must stick together. He shrugged his shoulders as she took a sip of tea. It breaks me heart to know you're in mill all day and I'm free of work. It's my job to be out labouring and your place in th' home. If it's bad for thee to be left at home, what makes thee think it's good for me? I may be female, but I'm just as human as thee. I've same needs for socialising with me fellows, and I'm sure thee benefit from thy contact with young Daniel as much as I do. I never thought of it like that afore, Daniel responded. I like being with Daniel, and I think he likes being with me. Bess laughed. Real problem is, we never get chance to be all together as a family enough, and that choice is neither thine nor mine, is it? Irene Rose awoke from her slumbers, the smell of lavender in her nostrils, and the crisp, clean feel of a fine linen pillow against her cheek. She'd retired to bed with all kinds of positive thoughts dancing through her fertile imagination. Her father's discussion with, or rather lecture to, Nathaniel West had not only pleasantly surprised her, but stimulated her own ideas and begun to clarify her ambitions. Ever since her mother's death, 6 years before when she just turned 13, her father had come to rely on her to take her mother's place in the home generally, and when entertaining guests in particular. He'd never asked what she'd like to do with her life. They'd never discussed further education, or the possibility she might have ambitions for a career of her own once she'd achieved adulthood. It wasn't that her father was unkind or uncaring. Quite the opposite. He treated her with the greatest respect, and, whilst not a particularly demonstrative man, he obviously loved her and would do anything for her. It was as though he'd fallen into a rut and become dependent. This situation hadn't worried Irene Rose at first, but as she became older she questioned her role in life. She was an intelligent, naturally inquisitive and caring person. She come into contact with Bess Ackroyd shortly after Bess had started employment. Since then, their paths had crossed on a number of occasions, and the more they had, the more Irene Rose had become interested in Bess and the quite different life she led. Over time they'd established a friendship. It wasn't a friendship of equals at first. They came from quite distinct and separate classes. The curious thing about their relationship from Irene Rose's point of view was that Bess, not only from an inferior class, but the younger of the two by a year, seemed to be much more knowledgeable. Moreover, this knowledge wasn't so much about basic things, shall we say the cruder aspects of life. It was about the higher planes, art, politics, science and philosophy. It wasn't as though Irene Rose was ignorant. She'd enjoyed a good basic education through personal tutors. She'd a questing mind and enjoyed reading, an enjoyment by no means compromised by a lack of materials. Her father was not only a practical man, but an enlightened one who delighted in keeping up with the latest scientific and artistic achievements. He'd an extensive library covering a wide range of subject matter. Nonetheless, she had to admit Bess was not only more knowledgeable, but articulate and expert at communicating her thoughts to others. In the natural order of things, One would have expected Irene Rose to be the source of enlightenment for Bess, whereas in reality the exact opposite was the case. Irene Rose's mind thrived as a result of her contacts and conversations with the cotton spinner, who sparked her imagination and encouraged her to think the unthinkable. She'd come to not only respect her working-class mentor, but to love her in the sense she'd do anything to defend, assist and further her interests. Perhaps more importantly, her father's performance the night before had provoked her thoughts in such a way that the germ of an idea as to how to best further those interests began developing in her mind. The points Matthew had made to Nathaniel West only served to confirm Irene Rose's faith in Bess, who, in her own unique way, sometimes quietly and sometimes with great passion and vehemence, had made much the same criticisms of the situation mill and factory workers faced, and drawn pretty much the same conclusions as to the likely effects. She climbed out of bed, quickly dressed, and made her way downstairs, determined to put her ideas to the test. Mary Upton looked up as Daniel entered her kitchen with young Daniel in his arms. "Is Bess Noel?" she asked. "Bess is already in the mill," he replied with a smile. "Sit this hand down, lad, there's tea in the pot." "Aye, all right, love, then I'm off to seek work." Mary generally looked after 5 of the mill workers' children, all of whom she'd helped deliver. Her ivy-clad cottage and long barn stood on the northern edge of Ancoats, in easy reach of the Gibraltar mill, and she was one of the area's local characters. Her father, John Failsworth, and his father before him, Adam, had been weavers. When her grandfather started, he rented the cottage Mary now lived in, the barn attached to it, and a couple of acres of land, having moved into the area in the year of 1751. Before the powered machine age, weavers had a reasonable life. Adam Failsworth bought wool, most of which came from nearby Saddleworth, on the border of the West Riding of Yorkshire, which was then carded and spun by his wife and daughters, ready to be woven by himself. His income provided a decent standard of living for himself and his family. A steady home market for his cloth existed. The vicious competition that had arisen from the later conquest of foreign markets by the mechanized water and steam-powered textile industry did not exist. Furthermore, it was a slowly growing market, keeping pace with the equally slow growth of population. In their leisure hours, of which there was no great shortage, Adam and his family cultivated their small plot of land, and whilst it wasn't the best soil, they grew sufficient vegetables to supplement the family diet. They kept a few chickens, which provided them with eggs, and had recourse to fresh milk and the provision of cheese and bacon from their farming neighbours. Their life, whatever its limitations, was far superior to that of the proletarian weavers of the factory age, with time to engage in sports and other pursuits. Like Mary, Adam's wife had been a midwife, and this had a lasting impact on the family's, and in particular Mary Upton's, fortunes. Emily Failsworth had attended the birth of the local squire's first son. The birth was a difficult one. Indeed, the physician employed by the squire made it clear he had to choose between the survival of his baby and that of his wife. Emily was having none of it, intervened and delivered the son safely and saved the mother's life. The squire, in his gratitude, had made over the cottage and barn to Adam, along with the 2 acres of land. Mary, an only child, had eventually inherited the property from her father. By then, the rural landscape surrounding the small holding had long disappeared, and it was surrounded by a myriad of mills, their tall, slender chimneys belching sulphurous smoke fumes into the atmosphere, with the waters of the Rochdale Canal forming the boundary on its eastern flank. South East Lancashire's population had increased tenfold in the intervening years, and that of Manchester probably more. Mary's barn had ceased to be used for weaving on her husband's death. Weavers were once part of the aristocracy of free, independent labour. By 1838, Handloom weavers' earnings were reduced to just over 2/3 of a female cotton spinner's wage. Their income cut to 9 or maybe 11 shillings a week at the most if they were fast and lucky, and for that they had to work a 14-hour day. Hargreaves, the inventor of the spinning jenny, had been a weaver, but mention his name and most weavers would want to spit on him. Daniel had finished his tea and taken his leave of Mary when he met Irene Rose in the street. "Morning, Miss Rose," he said, touching the peak of his cap. "Good morning, Daniel. Are you well?" "I am well, but I'll be better when I find work." "Well, I hope you do, Daniel." She bid him good luck and hurried on to Mary's. "So, Albert, you're saying there's not much you can do?" Councillor Albert Davitt placed the palms of his hands on the oak table and shook his head. "No, Matthew, I'm not saying that. There's much the corporation can do, but it takes time, and the sanitary police are overworked." Albert Davitt was a big man in stature, influence, and position. 5'10" tall, broad at the shoulders, with a shock of once black hair, now increasingly streaked with silver. He'd bushy eyebrows and eyes the colour of blue steel. He locked the latter onto his friend. "Leave it with me, Matthew. I'll have a word with some of my colleagues." "Just tell me one thing, Albert. Do you think I'm on the right track?" Yes, I do, old friend. I've thought pretty much the same as you as far as housing and street planning's concerned, since I first read Dr. Philip Kay's report on the 31 cholera epidemic. But we have to face up to the real problem, and that's the ownership of the land. Dr. Kay's a good man. He's our family physician and a personal friend. He's also highly frustrated that the situation has been allowed to fester so long. With each year that passes, the population increases and the problem gets worse. Do we have to wait until another outbreak of disease hits us before we do anything? Come, Matthew, you know our hands were tied. The corporation's not 12 months old. Yes, but we need to be making plans now for decent hygienic housing. We need to set about obtaining the powers from Parliament to carry the work out. Anyway, surely we're able to obtain sufficient funds to ensure the cesspits are regularly emptied and the dung heaps of human excrement cleared. It's not as though there aren't plenty of workmen available, ready and willing to undertake the work. Tackle that job, solve the problem of clean water provision, and we'll break the back of Manchester's health problems. For most of its existence, Manchester had been a small village lying at the confluence of two rivers, the Irk and the Irwell, although the original settlement from which its name derived was a Roman fort slightly further south, built on a small hill at the confluence of the Medlock and the Irwell, in the area known as Castlefield. Originally built in AD 79, the Roman castrum guarded two important roads, that from Chester to York heading northeast, and another heading north to Ribchester. The Roman name was Mamuseum, which itself was a Latinization of its Celtic name, meaning breast-shaped hill, the area being part of the territory of the Brigantes, the dominant Celtic tribe in what is now the north of England. In the Anglo-Saxon chronicles of AD 919, it is referred to as Mameseister. From the Norman conquest onwards, it became a quiet backwater in the shadow of its more important neighbour Salford, as a parish in the southeast of the Salford Hundred. Now, in 1838, it had overtaken Salford in population and stature, thanks to the textile industry, founded back in the 14th century by a small community of Flemish weavers, who specialised in weaving wool and linen goods. In the 16th century, an influx of Huguenot weavers, fleeing religious persecution, strengthened this early textile trade. The Flemish and Huguenot weavers were not the first immigrants to have had a significant and positive impact on the fortunes of their adopted town, nor would they be the last, nor could they have envisaged that their settlements would culminate in the growth of the world's first industrial city, and the premier commercial centre of Britain outside London. By 1838, Manchester was a cosmopolitan town, drawing on the talents of not only native Lancashire people, but also Welsh, Scots, Moravians, Germans, Italians, and Central European Jews. Eventually, with the growth of the trade in Egyptian cotton, Levantines would join them. Above all, the town owed much for its existence and prosperity to one particular group of migrants, a people who in the main did its dirtiest jobs, built and often manned its mills, suffered the worst deprivations and greatest exploitation, a people who formed the bulk of its handloom weavers, by then a dying trade, cut its canals and built its railways, erected its magnificent commercial and municipal buildings, and populated its filthiest slums, the much maligned Irish. This was so even in 1830, a good decade before the Great Hunger, or the Irish Famine as the English incorrectly called it. The word famine implies a lack of food available to feed the population. There was no shortage of food in Ireland in the late 1830s and 40s, in the shape of wheat, barley, oats, beef, mutton or pork, merely a shortage of potatoes that the mass of Irish people, impoverished and brutalised by their English and Anglo-Irish landlords, have been reduced to relying upon as their main source of sustenance. Worse still, its bullying English neighbour, so persistent in its determination to dominate and control, and so insistent on its right to govern Ireland, and thus assuming responsibility for its people's welfare, stood back and did nothing, content to see the Irish die of starvation or migrate. Understandably, facing widespread discrimination and vilification, the Irish in Manchester, both Catholic and Dissenter, developed a tradition in their early years of settlement of keeping their heads down and assimilating into the broader society. Despite this, they were often in the vanguard of the working class movement for reform, and were the backbone of Chartism. In 1837, the year before Matthew Ethero's discussion with Davitt, Manchester attained municipal borough status. The new borough incorporated the old town around the collegiate church of Mary the Virgin, St. George and St. Denis, by then known as Irish Town, and the rest of Old Manchester, including its fairly new commercial centre, with the townships of Chetham to the north, Beswick to the north-east, Ardwick to the east, Chorlton-upon-Medlock to the south-east, and Hume to the south. Salford lay on the opposite bank of the Irwell to the west. The commercial centre occupied an area roughly square in shape, about half a mile long and the same distance wide, consisting of offices and warehouses, traversed by wide open thoroughfares lined with magnificent shops and stores, enabling the men of property and trade to access the branch of the Bank of England in King Street, as well as the cotton and corn exchanges, the latter being located near the collegiate church and the former near the church of St. Anne. The whole area was so free of people's dwellings at night it was lonely and deserted, the few people traversing its lanes being watchmen equipped with dark lanterns and truncheons. Around this symbol of commerce and enterprise, the daytime domain of the bourgeoisie, in which every relationship was a cash relationship, and hidden from it lest the eyes and particularly the noses of the middle-class industrialists and merchants be offended, lay a belt of quarters, they could hardly be called houses or dwellings, solely occupied by the working classes. The degree of filth and squalor, and the broken-down nature of these habitations, into which scores of thousands of the toiling masses were crammed, only varied slightly according to their age and position. They stood cheek by jowl with mills, factories, bleaching, dye and textile printing works. The three principal rivers, the Irwell and Medlock, were their only sources of water, save for a couple of small springs, both controlled by breweries. Naturally, because mills need water in quantity, the oldest manufactories and workers' hovels crowded the river banks. Industrial effluents bleaches and dyes, animal and human excrement polluted the waters. As if this wasn't sufficient, a cholera cemetery stood on one bank of the Ur, and a pauper's graveyard, just downstream, occupied ground next to the Irwell. This belt of humid degradation averaged 1.5 to 2 miles wide, save on the western side. Here it found itself hemmed in betwixt the thoroughfare of Deansgate and the filthy waters of the Irwell, on whose opposite bank stood the equally obnoxious dwellings and places of employment of its Salford cousin. Travelling outside and away from this site of human misery, heading north to Cheetham Hill, or east to Hardwick, and the outskirts of Chorlton upon Medlock, or further south-east and south to the small townships of Rusholme, Fallowfield, Withington, Didsbury, and through the villages of Greenhace, Moss Side and Hulme to Chorlton cum Hardy, the housing gradually became superior and increasingly substantial. Eventually, having passed through the neatly planned streets housing the lower middle classes, one came to the splendid villas and palatial residences of the upper middle class, the new urban aristocracy of hard-nosed, hard-faced, keep-your-heads-to-the-grindstone industrial capitalists. The first thing to strike any new visitor to this metropolis was the ability of the rich to travel from their places of residence on the rural outskirts of the town to their offices or warehouses, to the Cotton Exchange or the Corn Exchange, to the Bank of England, or the theatres, art gallery, libraries and other places of culture and learning, without once setting eyes on a single working-class dwelling. The gas-illuminated shops and other buildings lining the thoroughfares comprising the boundary of the working-class belt, and those traversing that belt, hid the quarters of the labouring classes from the view of the bourgeoisie and casual tourist alike. Horse-drawn omnibuses taking the shortest routes through the city once every quarter or half an hour served these thoroughfares, delivering their cargo of money men, their wives, and dare we say their mistresses, once more to their clean, comfortable houses and the unpolluted air of their rural retreats. The second thing to strike any intelligent tourist who cared to probe a little deeper, particularly one with the instincts of an anthropologist, was the degree to which these two great classes of Mancunians, the owners of capital on the one hand, and those who sold their labour power to work with and make that capital productive on the other, had driven out all other classes. There were few left of those artisans, small tenant farmers, independent handicraft workers, or vegetable growers that once flourished in this part of south-east Lancashire. Only the shopkeepers, beer and gin palace owners, and the porkers, whose pigs roamed the narrow courts and alleyways of the slums eating garbage, but unfortunately producing shit at the same time. In short, only those small middlemen who catered for basic needs hung on. Nearly all work was machine work, the operatives who worked those machines merely hands. And yet, hidden from view, lurked the dark, invisible, malevolent arm of another, extremely tiny, mostly absent class. Absent in the sense they didn't live in and were seldom even seen in the town, who still wielded a significant influence over the affairs of this mighty centre of industry and commerce, an influence in many ways malign and leech-like, especially when studied from the point of view of the industrialists. This tiny group, so abhorrent too, and so often such an obstacle to the manufacturer's onward and upward progress, were the old landed aristocracy. These members of the old ruling elite still clung on to power, and owned the bulk of the land on which Manchester was situated, as well as the land on to which its future expansion depended. True, some of these aristocrats, such as the Duke of Bridgewater, whose estates happened to have vast quantities of coal beneath their surface, had thrown their lot in with the industrialists, realizing their particular interests coincided. In the process, they had become capitalists themselves. Others, however, were content to do little, not wishing to indulge in trade and occupation beneath their dignity, and at odds with their heritage. The landed gentry were, after all, people of leisure, proud to take life easy, only wishing to continue in their old ways, hunting and fishing and whatever other pursuits they engaged in. Their land in the Manchester area had had little productive value before the coming of the cotton industry and the subsequent replacement of water power by steam power. Of poor agricultural quality in the main, and possessed of no minerals worth speaking of, save clay, it had only provided a meagre income in rents. Now, however, the need for land had turned even the red clay into a valuable asset, it being the raw material for the production of bricks. Their lordships suddenly found themselves in the wonderful position of being able to make substantial profits, barely having to lift a finger. Of course, they had to prepare and write a 30 or 40-year lease, using a long-established legal form for each small parcel of land they leased out. Nonetheless, 30 seconds of effort wielding a quill pen, providing them with 3 or 4 decades' income, represented a perfectly acceptable sacrifice and expenditure of energy to most landowners. In addition, at the end of that period, the land remained theirs, as did any improvements made to it, including the buildings erected upon it. Give them their due, the aristocrats were not neglectful of their responsibilities to the past, recognizing that if some noble king had taken the trouble to first steal this land and then pass it on to one of their ancestors for services rendered, they had a God-given duty to hang on to it. This question of land ownership was the cause of the dilemma facing Matthew Etherow and his good friend Councillor Davitt, for it was one of the major causes of Manchester's pitiful housing, its unsanitary arrangements, and the consequent pestilence in the forms of cholera and typhus that swept through the town on a regular basis. If Davitt had had his way, all land would have been nationalised. That would solve all the problems of time-consuming surveys and obtaining parliamentary bills, and all the other nonsense that one had to go through to get a canal cut here, or a railway to transport goods from A to B, or to get a mill or a group of houses built at C and D. However, whilst a substantial number of manufacturers agreed with him, they and he knew it wasn't a practical proposition in the current political climate. It wouldn't be supported by either a Tory or Whig government. It whiffed of radicalism and socialism, although it was in fact a policy long cherished by industrialists. In itself, the problem of disease amongst their workforce wasn't a major problem for the manufacturers when mulling over their economic calculations and counting their profits. Labour was cheap and had a habit of engaging in sexual fornication. Like drink, sexual intercourse was one of the few pleasures working people could engage in, and engage in it they did, despite all the good advice provided to them by church and state. Of all sensory pleasures, it tended to be free at the point of need, an advantage it held over intoxication. Consequently, labour kept on reproducing. Labour was therefore expendable and easily replaced. Even if the workers ceased fornication and reproduction, heaven forbid, there were plenty of migrants available from the surrounding rural areas and from overseas to replenish supplies. Thus, the manufacturers always had a reserve army of unemployed at their disposal, and the consequent competition between the workers for any available jobs had the added benefit of keeping wages down. Furthermore, the native English working classes had a tendency to blame the Irish or any other recent migrants for creating the problem, a situation the establishment press was only too eager to promote on behalf of the mill owners, divide and rule being a well-tried and perfected weapon forged over many years by the British ruling elite. The real problem facing Councillor Davitt and all the middle class was that cholera, typhus, scarlet fever, or tuberculosis, once having taken hold, like fires had an unfortunate habit of reproducing the working class's democratic habits and showing their contempt for authority. The forces of disease and pestilence were as likely to target the rich as the poor, of all possible reasons for improving the lot of the poor, charity, a sense of duty, paternalism, compassion, or merely a simple respect for one's fellow human beings. It was this natural force, the fear of death by disease visited upon themselves, that above all motivated and strengthened the arm of the sanitary reformers. To give him his due, Matthew Etherow still lived in Ardwick in a house fronting the Green, despite the fact that 4/5 of the township was now proletarian. In this regard, he was one of an unusual minority. Most manufacturers, including Davitt, had moved to the south-west and south-east, well outside Manchester's polluted borders, the prevalent winds being south-westerly. However, Matthew was no ordinary run-of-the-mill mill owner. He genuinely sympathised with the plight of his workers, and looked upon them as fellow human beings, not merely hands. He'd set himself the mission in life of ensuring they received a fair crack of the whip. Unfortunately, the realities of capitalist competition made that much easier to aim for than to achieve, but Matthew had determined to try, and his general outlook in this regard found its reflection in the basic instincts of his daughter. Chapter 5. Bess breathed a sigh of relief as the bell rang. The noisy clatter and whine of the rows of spinning mules died down, as the overhead pulleys that drove the belts that powered the machines slowly came to a standstill, and the deafening noise turned into an eerie silence for a few seconds, until it too gave way to the clatter of clogs. The only movement, apart from people on the move, was cotton dust and lint slowly and gently descending through the air like fine grey snow on a winter's day. She moved to the basket containing her small parcel of food and her shawl, resting against the wall behind her. The atmosphere in the spinning room was extremely warm and damp, and the operatives wore the minimum of clothing for comfort. But when she left the mill, Bess knew it was likely to be chilly, and she'd need her shawl, which covered her head, shoulders and upper body, to keep warm. She couldn't afford time off work, and the last thing she needed was to catch a cold or mill fever. As she picked up her basket, a young girl, Anna Sutcliffe by name, approached. The lass had just turned 12, and like many of the operatives already had the grey skin pallor common to mill and factory workers. The look of hopelessness in her eyes, and the sad expression on her face, struck Bess forcibly. "Are they all right, Anna?" "Aye, Bess, I'm right." The words didn't match the youngster's forlorn and defeated expression. Bess watched as she passed and then frowned. The lass had stopped outside the door of the overlooker's office, knocked, and after a few seconds opened it and walked in. Jed Smith, the overlooker, wasn't renowned as a kindly man. Bess wondered why Anna had gone to see him. She shrugged, trying to dismiss the thoughts crowding in on her mind. Mary would be wondering where she was, and she had young Daniel to feed. She left the mill and turned right into Loom Street. She crossed a narrow lane. Nelson Mill towered to her right, and a crowd of workers stood outside a loading bay. Bess recognised a fellow spinner, Lisa Hodgkinson. "What's happening, Lisa?" she asked. "One at lasses, Mary O'Sullivan's been caught up in belt. She's dead, Bess." She looked at her friend and shook her head in dismay. "She were dragged up in there and smashed against ceiling. She's just a mangled mass of flesh and bone." Bess froze in shock. "Don't they have guards or drive belts? We've been asking for 'em for months past. They say they cost too much." Mary Upton and Irene Rose walked out of the barn as Bess approached. "There you are," Mary greeted the spinner. "Lyle Daniel's being made a fuss of." They walked to the cottage and entered the kitchen. Two of Bess's workmates, Charlotte Bessick and Clara Chadwick, sat at the kitchen table. Clara was breastfeeding her baby, and Charlotte had Daniel on her knee, whilst three other slightly older children played on the floor. "Daniel were fretting for you, Bess," Charlotte said. She passed the lad over to his mother. Bess put Daniel to her breast, thanking her friend. "There's been an accident at Nelson Mill, and I think Jed Smith's up to his out tricks." "What kind of accident?" Mary asked. "Lassie's dead, plucked up with machine belt." Does they know her name? Clara asked. O'Sullivan, Mary O'Sullivan. Charlotte turned white. The O'Sullivans were her next-door neighbours. Her husband's off work with a broken arm, and they've 2 children. It don't bear thinking about. What did you mean about Jed Smith? Irene Rose asked. Bess looked at her, cupping Daniel's head in her hand and stroking his hair gently as he suckled. I cannot swear to anything definite, but young Anna Sutcliffe disappeared into his room as I left me work. Irene Rose frowned. I don't understand. If they worked at mill they'd know, Miss Rose, Clara intervened. Jed's a perverted so-and-so, so he is. She might have been asking his advice, Mary Upton suggested. There's not a single woman at mill would go near Jed Smith, at least not on her own willingly, Clara replied. There's one way of finding out, Irene Rose said quietly, a grim determined look on her face. She rose from her seat and sat off towards Loom Street. The 4 women sat looking at each other. We must not let her go on her own, Bess pointed out. Mary Upton agreed. Bess, there's broth in pan next fire. Help yourself, and you too as well. I'll catch Miss Rose up. Irene Rose is a wonderful lady, Charlotte said. She's been closeted with Mary all morning. She's plans for a reading room for the mill operatives in barn and music in winter. How do they know? Clara asked. Mary told me when I come round just now. They want all the women operatives to come to a meeting on Sunday morning to talk about it. Jed Smith didn't know what hit him when Irene Rose burst into his office with Mary Upton close on her heels. You filthy, disgusting pig! Irene Rose screamed. Anna Sutcliffe burst into tears. She lay across the overlooker's desk, face down, her legs akimbo, her dress pulled up over her back, her buttocks naked. She stood up hastily as Jed withdrew from her, and covering herself as best she could, fled the room. Follow her, Mary, Irene instructed the midwife. Take her back home with you. I'll be along soon. She returned her attention to the overlooker. Don't you dare move from this room. Put that disgusting thing away and wipe that evil smirk from your face, she told him. I'll be back to deal with you in a moment. She left, looking for James Barcliffe, her father's mill superintendent. Leaving the spinning room, she entered the main entrance hall and climbed the stairs up the tower to the 3rd floor in the superintendent's office. She pushed open the door without knocking. James sat on the windowsill, looking down at the crowds of workers in the street below. He turned as she entered. Good afternoon, Miss Rose. This is a pleasant surprise. Not for me, Mr. Barcliffe, she responded sharply. Come with me, if you please. Jed Smith awaits. I want you to dismiss him immediately. He seems to think this mill is his personal brothel, and our young mill hands at his disposal. Mary Upton had caught young Anna up. They walked down Loom Street together, Mary doing her best to comfort the distressed girl, and assuring her she was in safe hands. They'd hardly stepped across the threshold of Mary's cottage before a breathless Irene Rose followed. She walked over to the stove in the fireplace, gathering up a bowl and ladled some of the nourishing stew she prepared earlier, utilising the leftovers from the meal she'd enjoyed with her father the previous evening. Right, Anna, sit yourself down and have some broth. Come, lass, you're safe and amongst friends. Dry up your tears and eat that. Once the girl calmed down and managed to swallow a few spoonfuls, she asked, How long has this been going on, child? 4 or 5 weeks. 4 or 5 weeks? Why haven't you sought help? The youngster looked at her with large brown eyes. Most operatives doesn't dare speak out, Charlotte answered for her. Jed'll have no doubt told her she'd lose her place. Anna's feyther's no work and her mother's a carder at Nelson Mill. They'll be hardly able to make ends meet, Clara explained. Anna'd do anything to keep a job, wouldn't you, love? The youngster nodded. But she could have informed somebody. Why not the union? Surely they could have stopped it. They only had to have a word with the mill superintendent or my father. Bess shook her head, feeling she'd let the youngster down. If I'd have known, I could have helped. But I didn't know, and Anna's not in the union. Overlookers tell young uns they'll be in trouble if they join. Well, we will just have to see what we can do, Irene Rose said quietly and firmly, comprehension dawning. I'm holding a meeting in Mary's barn on Sunday at 10. I want all you women to attend and spread the word amongst the others. I intended to raise the question of education, but now I'm going to raise the question of union membership as well. All the workers need to combine together if we're going to put a stop to this kind of abuse." The women looked at each other, trying to comprehend the mill owner's daughter's message. "Bess, I'm meeting my father in the Queen's Hotel at 2:15, Irene Rose announced. "I want you to accompany me." "I can't do that," the spinner protested. "It's bad enough making ends meet when our Daniel's in work. I can't afford time off, and neither can the doffers who work with me." "Don't worry, Bess, we'll go back to the mill first." She smiled reassuringly. "I'll speak to Mr. Barcliffe. He'll make sure the doffers are found other work. I'll guarantee your wages, even if I have to pay them out of my own pocket." "They mustn't do this, Miss Rose." "That's where you're wrong, Bess Ackroyd. It's something I must do, and you must help, or you're no friend of mine." Bess looked at Clara and Charlotte, her eyes seeking their support. Eventually Clara laughed. "They cannot refuse Miss Irene Rose. She's a feyther's daughter, and a feyther's thy master, Bess." "Clara's right, Bess," Mary Upton intervened. "Do as Miss Irene Rose bids you. It's for the best, lass." Charlotte nodded, affirming her agreement, whilst Anna Sutcliffe looked on in wonder, open-mouthed at this turn of events, until Irene Rose suggested she finish her stew before it went cold. "Bess Ackroyd, you have to stop behaving like this." "I don't know what they mean, I really doesn't, Miss Rose." The two women had returned to the mill, and Irene Rose had given James Barcliffe his orders. They were now heading towards London Road. "Firstly, you have to stop calling me Miss Rose. You can call me Irene, or Rose, or even Irene Rose. But if we're going to remain friends, you must call me by my name. Your name's Bess, and that's what I call you. Please do the same for me. I prefer Rose, but Irene would be a step forward." "It don't sound right, Miss. You're the one who's always pointing out it's working people who produce all the wealth, and without you the manufacturers would be worthless. I'm only asking you to treat me decent." The mill owner's daughter was becoming highly frustrated. "Bess, I thought you regarded me as a friend. If you don't, at least be honest and have the decency to tell me to my face, here and now." Bess glanced across at her companion. Rose sounded as cross as two short sticks. "I know they aren't me friend, but it's not easy, thou art not one. I'm a woman, Bess, and a mortal human being. We've always been able to talk to each other before. Please treat me as your equal." "But thou art the daughter of me meister. We're not equals, and ne'er can be." "Bess, I didn't choose my parents, and neither did you, any more than we chose where or when to be born. Nobody chooses their relatives any more than they choose their nationality. They're all accident to birth out with our control. But we can choose our friends, can't we?" she asked, a serious and earnest look on her face. "We're young women, chance in its wisdom has brought together. You inspire me, and I think we can achieve great things together, if we educate, help and support each other. But you have to meet me halfway and treat me as an equal. Are you prepared to do that?" Bess looked into Irene Rose's bright blue eyes and eventually smiled. "Aye, I'm prepared to risk it if thou art." "Good." Rose linked the spinner's arm. "You and me are going to change the world," she said gravely. "But first we'll start with Gibraltar Mill and all those who work in it and depend on it, including my father." They made their way into the lounge of the Queen's Hotel. Matthew Etherow looked up from his paper. "Rose, I thought we were going shopping for winter clothes. Why is Mrs. Ackroyd with you?" "We have rather more urgent and important things to undertake, father, than worry about shopping. Bess is here as my personal adviser and my friend. I've asked her to accompany me, and I've promised she will not lose any payment." Matthew's eyebrows rose, but before he had a chance to say a word, his daughter asked, "Are you aware that it's a common view amongst your overlookers they've the right to use your young female operatives for their own sexual gratification?" The mill owner seemed astonished. "Of course they don't. Their job is to supervise the work and make sure the youngsters are receiving adequate instruction. I caught Smith in the very act, taking advantage of a 12-year-old girl in his office during the shutdown for lunch today. I'll ensure he's disciplined. There's no need for you to worry your head over it. Father, you say there's no need for me to worry, but if I hadn't discovered this, who'd have informed you? The girl wasn't a willing participant, but she wasn't in a position to complain, either to another overlooker or to her fellow operatives. She'd been told if she told anybody she'd lose her job. She'd been told if she joined the union she'd lose her job. Jed Smith's been raping the girl 2 and sometimes 3 times a week for over a month. What means of redress were available to her? She had none, Father, and that can't be right. I'm holding a meeting on Sunday of all the women. I don't want to do it behind your back, and I hope to do it with your support, but I'm going to do it nonetheless. Matthew Etherell gazed into his daughter's eyes for a long moment. The news of Jed Smith's transgressions had shocked him, and the reason she'd elaborated why such transgressions could escape notice he found impressive and irrefutable. Eventually he smiled. "You are your mother's daughter, Rose, and that's a fact," he said, shaking his head. "Go on, tell me your plans. You have my full attention." Originally, my intention was to hold a meeting of the women operatives to propose we organise a library and education classes for them and their children, and that we should use the same venue for musical entertainment, dances and social gatherings in the winter. Matthew smiled again. "Do you have a venue in mind?" "Yes, Father. Mary Upton has agreed we can use her barn. Since her husband died, she has no use for it as a weaving shed." "How much will the rent be?" Irene Rose laughed at his sense of priority. "Mary's not asking for any rent. She says she has sufficient to live on. I'm proposing all the operatives pay a penny a week, and we use the income to purchase books and whatever else we need, and pay for the maintenance and upkeep of the barn." Matthew nodded, more than a little impressed by his daughter's ideas, and the way she articulated them. "The barn's not very big. I'm sure you'll need a larger building in time. There's room for expansion. I've already discussed this with Mary. She not only owns the barn, but also the land adjoining it. But we must start small. Involve our operatives, particularly the women, in running the institute. They'll be the best judges of when it needs to expand, and they have contacts with building workers and craftspeople who can undertake the work at a reasonable cost. Bessie's husband, for example, is a skilled carpenter, and like many craftsmen is out of work. He can make furniture and undertake all kinds of constructional work. If we pay workers directly and cut out the middlemen, it will be far cheaper." "You've thought this through, haven't you, Rose? Does it make sense to you?" "Yes, it does indeed," the mill owner replied. "In fact, for every penny the operatives put into this project, I will undertake to provide an additional penny, providing you don't let them know where it is going from. I will establish a trust fund that you can administer, along with 4 of the operatives." "That will be wonderful, Father. You said this project was your initial idea to put to the meeting. What else are you thinking of?" "I intend to begin 2 campaigns, if Bess will help. Firstly, to encourage every operative in the mill to join their appropriate trade union and support the campaign for the 10-hour day. Secondly, to encourage the women to form a branch of women Chartists. One exists in Hume and another in Chorlton upon Medlock, if we require advice." "And what do you think about all this, Mrs. Ackroyd?" "I'm much in agreement with all Miss "Father," Irene Rose interrupted, "will you please tell Bess to stop calling me Miss? My name's Rose, and that's what I wish my friends to call me. Bess agreed to do this earlier, but I think your presence is overawing her." Matthew laughed and shook his head. "You've heard my daughter, Bess. She's intent on being your equal, it seems. I think it's best to do as she asks. I usually end up doing so." He paused as he weighed up the implications of Rose's proposals. "In many ways your ideas for an institute run by the operatives fits in with some ideas I've been working on for improving the housing available. I've just had a meeting with like-minded people. However, Rose, Are you aware putting your ideas into practice could have repercussions that indirectly may affect you in a negative way? How do you mean, Father? Let's assume the mill operatives organise in the way you envisage, and their campaign for the 10-hour day is so successful, I'm persuaded to implement it. He glanced at Bess, a twinkle in his eye. It's not really in my interest to tell you this, Bess, but I'd cope. I doubt if it would cost me much. At first the amount of yarn we produce would be reduced, but as workers' health improved, as they benefited from increased leisure time, production would soon rise, and I'm sure there would be a reduction in accidents and other hold-ups, which are more often than not caused by tiredness due to overwork. I'm sure that would be the case, Father. That's my own way of thinking and all, Bess asserted quietly. But if I was to concede such improvements on my own, what do you think would be the reaction of my fellow manufacturers? Do you think they'd follow suit and call me a hero and a philanthropist, or accuse me of being a radical socialist and ostracise me? All us workers know the facts of life, Mr. Etherow, Bess stated firmly, gradually finding her confidence. We're aware of how the cotton manufacturers organise. We know how they vilified Robert Owen. Next good employer who finds he's lost his friends and customers won't bit last. Some of us just say, so what, that's not our problem. But others of us think different. That's why we intend to step up the campaign for union organisation and the 10-hour bill throughout the district. If one employer concedes, we'll ensure most at rest have to follow. That's why we want it made law of the land, and why we want the People's Charter and People's Members, so best mill owners aren't victimised by bad uns. Is that your own view, Bess, that industrial action and parliamentary reform need to go hand in hand? Aye, both are needed, the spinner informed him. We need to better our working conditions and protect our gains by obtaining representation in Parliament and enshrining them in law. She smiled before adding, that's why I'm a Chartist as well as a trade unionist. And that's why I'm a Chartist as well, Father, Irene Rose added. I think Bess is right. The mill owner smiled. What about your husband, Bess? What does he think? Daniel's desperate looking for work, but I'm educating him slowly. Rose laughed at her friend's reply. Bess is a fountain of knowledge and a good teacher, Father. She could teach you a thing or two about the housing question, come to think about it. Bess glanced at her and shook her head. Our Daniel's real expert on the housing question. Matthew Etherow looked at the two young women. Both had impressed him and provoked new ideas of his own, but he didn't voice his thoughts. He decided he had a little more investigation to undertake. Daniel, what art thou doing here? Bess's husband stood by the fire in Mary Upton's kitchen, with young Daniel in his arms. It was turned 35 minutes past 8. Bess had just finished her shift in the mill, having returned to work at 3:30, following her meeting with Mr. Etherow. I came to meet you and spend some time with our Daniel. I've heard you've had an unusual day according to what Mary here reckons. He smiled. I'm fair knackered, lass, but I think I might have prospect for new work soon. There's an iron foundry being started in West Gorton. There you are, Bess. Can you give your... A breathless Irene Rose put her head round the door and laughed. I was going to say, can you give your husband a message? But I see he's here. Good evening, Daniel. Good evening, Miss Rose. What canst I do for you? My father would like to meet you. He sent me special to see if you were free tomorrow morning. Can you be at our home in Hardwick at 9:30? Aye, Miss Rose. Rose, why does thee feyther want to see Daniel? I'm not quite sure, Bess, but he was most insistent. I think it's to do with his ideas on housing. I think he wants to pick Daniel's brains. She pulled 2 pamphlets out of her basket. Father asked me to give you these. Bess took them, and having glanced at one, passed it over to Daniel, before studying the cover of the other. They were both works by Robert Owen, one of which she'd read. The pamphlet she passed over to her husband was entitled A New View of Society, and dated 1813, whilst the other, entitled Observation on the Effects of the Manufacturing System, was dated 1817. Much to Irene Rose's surprise, Bess said her father had a good taste in literature. She informed us she'd read the publication she passed on to Daniel, although she admitted she was unfamiliar with the second. "Have thee read any of Owen's works?" she asked. The mill owner's daughter replied in the negative. "I think they should, Rose, especially his New Moral World. Owen's an inspiration, and his ideas on education aren't like thine and mine." In truth, Irene Rose's ideas on education were largely influenced by Bessie's ideas, and Bessie's were much influenced by those of Robert Owen. Chapter 6. "Thank you for coming to see me, Daniel." Daniel stood with his cap in his hand, overawed by his surroundings. He'd made his way from Ancoats, threading his way through the lanes and alleyways onto London Road. Eventually he'd reached the fine Georgian house fronting Hardwick Green, and entered through a side gate to reach the tradesman's entrance. Irene Rose was at work in the rear garden, digging and weeding. Upon seeing her father's visitor, she greeted him warmly. "You're early. Come this way, Daniel," she'd said, ushering him through an open set of French windows into a drawing-room, through which they passed into a wide varnished oak-lined passageway with a polished wood parquet floor, down which she conducted him to her father's library. "Sit down, Daniel, and you too, Irene Rose. I think this might be of interest to both of you." The mill owner smiled. "Now, Daniel, Bess tells me you're an expert on housing. What can you tell me?" Daniel shook his head. "Bess is likely imagining," he responded. "I know nought about construction of such fine houses like this, and—" "I suppose not," Matthew replied. "But you do know about the houses you and other working people have to live in. Why do you think they're so badly constructed, and what needs to be done?" "It's all down to land ownership, Mr. Etherow. You see, a couple of builders spot a piece of vacant land. They arrange to lease it, maybe for 30 years, to build houses on to rent out. They build cheap as they can, because after 30 years the land and everything on it reverts back to the landlord. If you look at houses round your mill, you'll find some have narrow-end bricks showing, and some will have long lengths showing. First lot aren't built better than second, 'cause walls are thicker, though neither aren't built right." "How do you mean, Daniel?" Irene Rose asked. "Them with narrow-end bricks showing have thicker walls, as I says, miss. Them with long sides showing but the narrow side thick. If they were built proper, walls would be 2 bricks placed parallel thick, with gap for air to circulate in between, with occasional brick put in endwise to bond 'em together for strength." The mill owner smiled, realising Daniel knew his subject. "The point is, builders don't build 'em right," Daniel continued. "They build 'em so when lease is up and they can no longer collect rents off poor tenants, owner of land don't benefit. You see, landlord would then rent 'em out for himself, and builders would be out of pocket. For the same reason they doesn't keep 'em in good repair. That's one of the main reasons houses are so damp. You see, ventilation in 'em relies on draft-up chimney, and many on us can't afford to keep fire lit all the time, and without fire there's no draft, and without draft there's no ventilation, and without ventilation the houses are damp. That's the be-all and end-all of it." Bess, Clara and Charlotte walked together to Mary Upton's to have their midday meal and look after their children's needs. Young Anna Sutcliffe, who they decided to take under their wing, accompanied them. As they approached Mary's small holding, Irene Rose, together with her father and Daniel, approached from the opposite direction in the Etherows' trap. Daniel carried a large basket containing a great pan wrapped in cloths to retain the heat. "There you are, girls," Irene Rose greeted them. "I've brought some food for you all." "That's good of you, but you're spoiling us, Miss Rose," Clara protested. "We all need nourishment," Irene Rose retorted. She led the way into Mary's neat kitchen. Bess picked young Daniel up out of his wicker basket, and Clara did likewise with her daughter, Emma. Both put them to the breast, and they began to suckle, while Clara's 2-year-old son Jonathan continued to play with Charlotte's twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel. They were soon joined by Anna. "Good afternoon, Mary. I brought company to meet you. Have you met my father?" "Aye, your feyther and me have met more than once, Miss Rose," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Sit thyself down, Mr. Etherow. It's good to see you again. You're always welcome here, thou knows." Matthew smiled. Mary Upton had attended his wife and delivered Irene Rose safely into the world. "It's good to see you looking so well, Mary. It's been a long time since we last met. I won't sit down. Let the women be seated. They've been on their feet for the past 4.5 hours. There's enough room for all round my table." Mary turned to Bess's husband. "Can you bring them chairs over from fireside, Daniel? We'll all break bread together, like good friends should." Irene Rose relieved Daniel of his burden and placed the pan at the centre of Mary's table, whilst Mary busied herself providing bowls and spoons for all. "My, that smells greatly, Miss Rose." "It's only rabbit stew," Irene Rose said with a laugh. She almost added that she'd obtained the rabbits from her regular supplier, and they'd been plump and were of high quality, but she wasn't sure if her father would understand. Her regular supplier, Martin Everthwaite, was a poacher, and she was sure the rabbits came off a neighbour's land. "God help us, Daniel. I knew things were bad, but not as bad as this. I could have shown you far worse, Mr. Etherow." At Matthew's request, Daniel had shown the mill owner around some of the meaner lanes of Ancoats, and had then taken him across Great Ancoat Street, through a network of narrow alleyways and courts, into an area bounded by Store Street, Travis Street and London Road. The state of the lanes and houses here were even more wretched than those in Ancoats, the worst built on top of and down the steep slope of an irregular hill composed of clay, descending into Store Street. Their narrow unpaved alleyways formed rough, irregular and unplanned drains, down which filthy streams of evilly smelling, rubbish-strewn and germ-infested, thick, slimy water trickled. Flies swarmed above in dense black clouds. The unfortunate inhabitants of the area were crowded into broken-down, dilapidated dwellings, some condemned to reside in obscure, damp, musty cellars, designed to contain the damp, not to provide human habitation. The structures defied all attempts by their tenants to preserve even a vestige of the cleanliness required to ensure a modicum of decent health. Each row of 30 or so houses had but one privy between them, and the surrounding area of each privy was a mess of human excrement, giving off the most putrid and vile essences. Daniel explained that most houses contained no more than 2 rooms, and some were home to 4 families and sometimes more, whilst few provided shelter to a single family. Often the inhabitants were shift workers, the day shift workers giving up their beds to the night shift workers, as and when required. "Bess, love!" Bess, Clara and Charlotte stopped in their tracks at the sound of Daniel's voice and turned towards him. "What art thee so excited about, Daniel?" "I've getten a job and I'm on more money than I could ever hope for. I start on Monday next." His wife looked up at him, her eyes narrowed, a frown on her face, not quite believing what he'd said. He grinned and put his arms around her. "I'm going to be Deputy Building Superintendent for Mr. Etherow," he said, his voice full of enthusiasm. "You won't have to work no more, Bess." "I'm very pleased for thee, Daniel," she said quietly, "but I'll decide whether I work or not." She broke away from him and gazed into his eyes. "I've things to do myself, and need to keep me job at mill if I'm going to organise union and help me friends and comrades, as I promised myself and Rose I will." "Bess," Charlotte said, "you don't have to stay at mill on our account. Listen to what Daniel's—" Bess shook her head, an obstinate look on her face. "I've listened, but it don't alter facts. I need to work to organise, and that's what I'm determined to do, so they may all accept it. I'm a trade unionist and a Chartist, and I will not be deflected from my purpose. The only real way working people can guarantee to better themselves in this world is to better all of us together. On our own we stand no chance. We've nowt but toil and trouble afore us, no matter how good things might seem today." Chapter 7. Sunday, the 30th of September, and the sky high above Manchester remained virtually free of cloud, although the filth pumped up into the atmosphere by its chimneys the day before still lingered in a yellow haze above the town. None the less, it was a dry autumn day with a slight chill in the air, as Bess made her way to Mary Upton's barn to listen to Irene Rose outline her plans to the women operatives. Daniel Ackroyd had agreed to meet his wife at noon, having decided to take advantage of the pleasant weather to go for a walk. With young Daniel in his arms, he set off, weaving his way through the narrow lanes of Ancoats onto Union Street, where, having passed in the shadow of the towering walls of McConnell's 8-storey Sedgwick Mill, he accessed the towpath of the Rochdale Canal and began walking towards Newton Heath. Daniel had often tramped along this self-same towpath on a Sunday with his father, when still a kid. Over the 15 years or so since his father first introduced him to the canal, its surrounding landscape had changed dramatically. Mills and factories now lined its banks, where, not so long before, there had been views of open countryside. Nonetheless, he still found it held a magnetic attraction for him. Bushes and trees, hawthorn and pussy willow, unknown in any other part of the area, still managed to grow along its banks, and on the wider stretches reeds and waterweed broke the surface of the placid water, tinging its surface with welcome browns and greens, providing a haven for water and bird life. Even here, in industrial Ancoats, coot, moorhen, and various breeds of duck still survived. The canal might be the work of man, but its water was a gift from nature, and she still insisted on populating it with wildlife. The liquid ribbon, heading north on its 33-mile journey to Rochdale, reflected the sky as well as the towering walls of the mills. It seemed to hold out the promise, at least in Daniel's fertile and ever-hopeful mind, of a mysterious, greener and pleasanter land somewhere in the distant Pennine Hills that embraced the northern, eastern and southeastern areas around Manchester like some gigantic protective arm. He was about to sit down on a mooring bollard to take a welcome rest when the sound of a plop attracted his attention. He walked over to the bank, clutching young Daniel in his arms, wondering what creature had caused the rings of disturbance spreading outwards on the canal surface, when he stopped dead in his tracks. A frog crouched on the flagstone, within an inch of his clog. He bent down and gently picked it up, resting it in the palm of his hand to show it to his son. The creature didn't move, whether from exhaustion or shock, or a combination of both, Daniel couldn't be sure. "Look, young Daniel, look at frog, son." The lad looked, his little face wreathed in smiles. His hand moved towards the amphibian's dark green rear, but before his stubby outstretched finger could make contact, the frog made up its mind and leapt for freedom. It took off in a great arc, its front and rear legs akimbo, and dived into the safety of the water. "See how it swims, young un," he said. "I'll be teaching thee to do that soon." Daniel's mind wandered back to a time long before. His own father had shown him frogs swimming in a small pool before he strode out semi-naked into the quiet waters of the River Medlock one sunny day in Daisy Nook. He gently held him by the waist face down, instructing him to move his arms and legs, mimicking the frogs when teaching him to swim. He hugged his son close and silently promised, not for the first time, he'd do everything possible to provide him with a better life than he, or Bess, had inherited, just as his father had tried to do for him. When Daniel eventually reached Mary Upton's, the sight that met his eyes surprised him. 6 great trestle tables filled Mary's yard, each with a dozen people sat at them, mainly women and children, helping themselves to cold fried bacon, cheese and bread. Others occupied the barn, where he eventually found Bess in animated conversation with Irene Rose. The banner they'd carried the previous Monday on the Chartist demonstration once more hung on the barn wall in pride of place. "Ah, there thou art, Daniel," Bess greeted him. "They'd best get some food afore it's all devoured." "You seem to have had a good turn-out," he laughed, kissing the end of his wife's nose affectionately. "I think we've made a reasonable beginning," Irene Rose smiled. "Sit yourself down, and I'll sort some nourishment for you." "Nay, I can look out for myself, Miss Rose." "Why are men so obstinate?" she asked Bess, before turning back to him. "Just sit down and do as you're told, Daniel Ackroyd. I won't be a moment." "Come, Daniel, sit this all down here," Bess urged him. "I needs to talk to thee, and so does Rose." "Did the meeting go well, Bess?" "Aye, I think so. Rose has good grasp at issues. Some at lasses were a bit suspicious of her at first, her being Gaffer's daughter, but barriers soon came down." We've elected a committee to organise a social at the end of October and another to look at a programme of education. I've been asked to find a speaker from Union and another from the Chartists, and we want thee to make a stage for us. A stage? Aye, a platform for the musicians and speakers or against the wall. Here you are, Daniel, get that down you. Irene Rose placed a plate full of food and a pot of small beer in front of him. There's something I forgot to mention. Father's arranged a visit to Quarrybank Mill. He wants you to see how the Greggs have organised the cottages for their workers and the layout of their mill. That means Robert Hyde Gregg's mill? Yes, that's right, Bess. You don't sound pleased. Have they ever been there, Rose? Only when I was a child. Mother and Father took me for a meal with old Samuel Gregg some years before he died. We visited the mill briefly. It's out in the countryside and seemed idyllic. It's a water mill. Is there something I should know? Do they know the Greggs use pauper children as apprentices and don't pay 'em? Irene Rose shook her head. Surely they must pay them wages. Bess placed a hand on her friend's arm. I knows enough about Greggs to know they're charlatans posing as do-gooders and reformers, but I'm no expert. She rose from her seat, young Daniel in her arms. Give us a moment, and I'll bring somebody o'er who is. The spinner went out into the yard, returning moments later with a young girl. Rose, this is my good friend Amy Redbank. She's just turned 14. She turned to the youngster. Amy, can they tell Rose all about Quarrybank Mill at Thorne and Robert Hyde Gregg? The youngster turned pale, looking frightened and let down. Oh, Bess, how could you? You promised ne'er to tell on me. I give you me trust. Don't fret this sound, lass, Bess reassured her. Just tell Miss Rose what they know. No harm'll come to thee. Whatever's the matter? Irene Rose asked quietly. Surely it can't be that bad. Come on, lass, sit thee down, next to our Daniel, Bess urged the girl before turning her attention back to Rose. Amy's a runaway, she exclaimed. She's frit they'll send her back to Quarrybank Mill. Rose looked at Bess and then at Amy. She took the youngster's hand in her own and squeezed it reassuringly, looking into her slate-grey eyes. You've nothing to worry about, Amy. I give you my solemn pledge. Nobody's going to send you anywhere. Your place is with us. You're one of our family. Just tell me about Quarrybank. Hypocrites! How could they? Irene Rose asked herself. She'd returned home after agreeing tactics with Bess and Daniel as to how Daniel should handle his trip to Quarrybank with her father in the morning, and determined she should accompany them. The conversation with Amy had proved to be an eye-opener. Irene Rose, like many of her class, had always believed Quarrybank Mill in Style, Cheshire, to be a model community, an example of a factory colony set in beautiful countryside to be admired and emulated. If any stranger came to Manchester seeking information about mill organisation or workers' welfare, this was the place they were invariably conducted to and shown, rather than the filthy reality and urban squalor of mills in the town. The mill had been founded by Samuel Gregg in 1784, in a steep-sided narrow valley on the banks of the Bollin, whose waters came off the gritstone watershed of the south-western edge of the Peak District moors. The small turbulent river, a tributary of the Mersey, which rarely ran dry and whose waters were gathered and conserved in a mill dam to ensure adequate supplies on the rare occasions when it did, drove the mill's iron water wheel. Samuel converted farm buildings to house his workers, but later built cottages in the nearby hamlet of Style to rent to them. Adjacent to the mill, he'd also built an apprentice house to house his child labour, kindly provided to him by the overseers of the poor of surrounding parishes. Amy, as she now called herself, although that was not her baptismal name, had been handed over as an indentured apprentice on her 10th birthday in June 1834 by the parish of Cheadle. Robert Hyde Gregg, who had taken over the mill on his father's retirement in 1832, received payment of £2 2 for taking on his new charge. She, in turn, was required to labour for him until her 18th birthday, without any form of payment apart from her lodgings, food and clothing. At first, despite the long hours and the hard back-breaking nature of the work, followed most days by a stint at vegetable gardening and basic lessons, she'd not been displeased, thinking it would be a definite improvement on the workhouse from whence she came, and would provide her with the means to build a better future for herself. True, the mill work was dangerous, and, like many of her compatriots, the youngster had lost a finger in her first year as a result. Employed as a scavenger, armed with a brush, she'd to sweep under the spinning machines, obliged to lie flat or bent double to avoid capture by the moving parts of the machinery. In a way, the early loss of a finger had been a good omen. It taught Amy to watch out for the very real physical dangers she faced, and, as a result, she took extra care. Not a few of her predecessors had suffered broken limbs and much worse. She accepted her lot in life meekly, with good grace and due civility, as she'd been taught, until one of the mill overlookers began to use her as his personal sex slave. At that point, shocked, frightened, humiliated and desperate, the 11-year-old determined to make her escape. She'd made her way to Manchester, walking the 20 or so miles to get there, hiding in hedges every time she heard a horse and cart approaching, or sighted anybody on the open road, scared she'd be returned to her tormentor. She called herself Amy, in case warrants were out for her arrest, and managed to win a place at Gibraltar Mill, after one of the operatives had found her sleeping in the open on the canal bank, and taken pity on her. Her benefactor, a good-natured woman, Maggie by name, took her into her own home, and once having heard the girl's story, made her one of the family, and informed her employer the child was her niece, whose parents had died in a house fire. She'd given her the surname Redbank, as the canal bank comprised red clay. Irene Rose had naturally been shocked at the girl's story, especially as it came so soon after her discovery of the overseer's transgression at her father's mill. However, both Amy and Bess had provided further information, which cast even more doubt in her mind about the true nature of Quarrybank Mill and the relationship between its owner, his managers, and their workforce. She determined to say nothing to her father at this stage, but to take advantage of her forthcoming visit to Style to discover the truth for herself.